When you really think about the identity of a nation, you usually expect some kind of, I don't know, thematic consistency, like a solid brand.
Right, a neat little package.
Exactly. You close your eyes and you picture Copenhagen, right? You see the impossibly attractive people riding those cargo bikes through the rain, the pastel-colored 17th century houses on the canal.
Everyone just living in this state of perpetual hitch.
Yeah, the brain just categorizes it instantly. You think, yes, Scandinavia, the happiest place on earth. It's this
Right.
cozy, progressive, high-tax utopia where everything just sort of magically works.
It is a very comforting image. I mean, humans naturally prefer geopolitical narratives that are simple. We really want entire countries to fit neatly onto a glossy, heavily filtered postcard. It saves us the trouble of dealing with the contradictions.
But the moment you actually step past the tourism board slogans and you look at the raw machinery of their political system, that glossy postcard doesn't just tear, it completely disintegrates.
It really does. The reality of what is happening in Denmark today is not cozy at all.
No, it's not some idealistic utopia. It is, according to the sources we're looking at, the absolute definition of ruthless mathematical pragmatism. Welcome to the Topic Lens podcast, and in today's deep dive, we are getting into all of it because it is Tuesday, March 24th, 2026.
Which means right now the polls are open across Denmark.
They are. They open in the morning and they will close at 2000 hours. Or 8:20 p.m. Danish time tonight. And you might have seen a quick headline cross your feed this morning about a European coalition struggling, or maybe a brief clip on CNN about a dispute over an island in the Arctic.
But today, we're giving you the unvarnished reality of what is actually on the ballot.
Right, because this isn't just a localized election in a country of 6 million people. This is essentially a live, high-stakes laboratory for every major democracy currently navigating the absolute chaos of the 21st century.
The stress test happening in Denmark today is centered around paradoxes that are currently tearing other nations apart.
Exactly. Just look at the contradictions here. How does a nation universally recognized as the happiest country in the world simultaneously enforce some of the most draconian restrictive immigration laws in Europe?
And why is a traditionally left-wing prime minister aggressively teaming up to govern with her most bitter traditional right-wing rivals?
Right. And in what feels like a literal glitch in the simulation, why is the President of the United States actively trying to annex a massive piece of their sovereign territory?
To answer any of those questions, you really have to completely jettison the American and even the Southern European stereotypes of the so-called Nordic model.
You have to throw out the fairy tales.
Exactly. You have to look at the deeply cynical, highly tactical nature of how power is actually wielded in Northern Europe.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a massive stack of source material today. We've got pre-election polling data updated just hours ago, comprehensive historical analysis of the Scandinavian economic trust model, geopolitical intelligence reports focusing on the Arctic theater, and this part is wild, some incredibly dense essays breaking down recent, highly damaging corruption scandals rocking the Nordic elite.
We are going to decode the mechanics of what all these sources are telling us.
Impartially, too. We're exploring both the left-wing and right-wing strategies to control an increasingly fractured society, just reporting what the sources show. So when the results start rolling in tonight, you actually understand the tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface.
And before we can even look at the players on the board today, we have to look at the board itself, because the rules of how a Danish election even happens are, well, they're completely foreign to how the US or the UK operates.
Yeah, if you are accustomed to the American system, you operate on very rigid structural timelines. You know exactly when the next presidential election is. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November every 4 years. You can literally mathematically map it out a century in advance.
Even neighboring Sweden operates on a rigid schedule. They hold elections on the second Sunday in September every 4 years. The calendar completely dictates the politics.
But Denmark completely flips that dynamic. There is no fixed date.
Right. The only constitutional restriction is that the Danish parliament, the Folketinget, can sit for a maximum of 4 years.
Within that 4-year window, the sitting prime minister holds what is essentially a geopolitical superpower.
They can unilaterally call a snap election at literally any moment they choose.
Which means Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen woke up on February 26th of this year, walked to a podium, and basically said, all right, the election is happening in 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
She threw the entire nation into a lightning-fast campaign sprint. I mean, think about the sheer logistical terror of trying to run a national campaign in the United States or the UK in 21 days.
It alters the entire psychology of leadership. It creates a system heavily weighted toward tactical opportunism.
How so?
Well, in a fixed-date system, a leader has to endure periods of low approval and simply pray that the calendar eventually favors them. In Denmark, the prime minister is meticulously monitoring polling data, domestic crises, global events, just waiting for the precise mathematical moment when the opposition is fractured.
Or when their own popularity artificially spikes. Politics is no longer about enduring the storm. It is about calling the election the exact second the sun peeks out.
And the strategy of how you govern once you call that election is even wilder. Our sources highlight a structural concept that fundamentally changes how these politicians interact. It is called negative parliamentarism.
Negative parliamentarism. This was fascinating to read about in this stack. So, if I'm reading the mechanics of this correctly, forming a government in Denmark is not about winning a popularity contest. It is essentially a survival reality show.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. You don't need 50% of the parliament to affirmatively vote for you to become prime minister. You just need to mathematically ensure that 50% of the parliament doesn't actively vote to kick you off the island. You just have to avoid a vote of no confidence.
That is the exact mechanism. In a system built on positive parliamentarism, you need a proactive affirmative majority to endorse your leadership. Negative parliamentarism simply requires the absence of a unified opposition.
So as long as 90 out of the 179 members of parliament do not actively press the red button to remove you, you get to run the country.
Yes, but think about how that changes the incentives for a politician.
Right, because if I'm a politician in a positive system, I have to promise my coalition everything under the sun to keep them happy so they vote for me. But in this negative system, I don't need the other parties to love my platform. I just need to make sure they hate the alternative slightly more than they hate me.
Which is why minority governments are the absolute norm in Denmark. A prime minister will frequently govern with a small coalition that only controls, say, 35% of the seats.
Wow, just 35%.
Because they don't have a built-in majority, they cannot govern through ideological bulldozing. They have to negotiate every single piece of legislation on a case-by-case basis.
Which means they might partner with the far left to pass a massive green energy subsidy on a Tuesday, and then turn around and partner with the far right to pass a strict border control measure on Thursday.
Exactly. It mandates a level of flexibility that deeply frustrates ideological purists.
But if we apply this lens to today's election, we really have to ask why Mette Frederiksen chose this specific moment to pull the ripcord. Right, because her 4-year term wasn't set to expire until late 2026. She called it 7 months early.
The official press release reasoning was that she wanted to give voters a mandate on important political questions.
Yeah, specifically pointing to a highly controversial new wealth tax proposal her party drafted, targeting the top 1%. She claimed she needed the public's blessing before implementing such a structural economic shift.
But that is the narrative designed for public consumption. If you analyze the political timeline provided in our stack, the actual catalyst was clearly the Greenland crisis.
Oh, absolutely. She had just experienced this massive, albeit temporary, surge in domestic approval, a kind of stateswoman boost, after publicly standing up to the United States over the sovereignty of Greenland.
She basically looked the U.S. president in the eye on the global stage, refused to back down, and the Danish public rallied behind her. She looked unshakable.
And under the ruthless logic of a snap election system, you do not let a geopolitical polling bounce go to waste. You don't wait 7 months to see if the public gets bored or if an economic downturn erases your goodwill. You cash in the chips immediately.
But here is where the strategy seems to hit a brick wall. Even with that temporary boost in popularity, the actual government she has been leading for the past 4 years is historically despised by the electorate.
Yeah, to understand why today's vote is a dead heat with a massive chunk of undecided voters, we have to look at how Mette Frederiksen broke a 40-year-old unwritten rule of Danish politics.
For generations, the Danish political landscape was highly legible. It was bifurcated into two distinct predictable camps, the red bloc and the blue bloc.
The red bloc being the left-leaning, welfare-centric, higher-tax coalition traditionally led by the Social Democrats, and the blue bloc being the right-leaning, business-friendly, tax-cut-focused coalition traditionally led by a party called Venstre.
And just as a quick side note from the sources, Venstre literally translates to left in Danish.
Which is so confusing.
It is. Even though they are the traditional right-wing party, the name originated from class dynamics in the 1800s, but functionally today, they are the conservative free market anchor.
Power simply oscillated between these two blocs. If the public was tired of high taxes, they voted blue. If they were tired of welfare cuts, they voted red.
But following the 2022 election, Mette Frederiksen's Social Democrats emerged victorious. And instead of forming a standard red bloc government with her left-wing allies, she initiated a profound structural shock. She reached across the aisle and formed the SVM government.
S for the Social Democrats, V for Venstre, and M for the Moderates, which was a newly formed centrist party. I am just trying to contextualize how massive a shift this is. If you map this onto American or British politics, this is the equivalent of the Democrats and the Republicans, or Labour and the Tories, deciding to suspend their rivalry and just co-govern in a joint cabinet.
The stated architectural goal of the SVM coalition was to create an era of hyper-stable, sensible, middle-of-the-road governance. The theory was that by locking the two biggest parties into an alliance, they could ignore the extreme demands of the far left and the far right and enact long-term pragmatic reforms.
But the sources reveal that the theory completely collapsed upon contact with reality. The voters didn't feel stabilized, they felt utterly alienated.
It makes sense if you think about it. If I am a left-wing voter in Denmark and my hospital wait times are increasing or my social benefits are being trimmed, my natural democratic instinct is to blame the right-wing party and vote them out.
But if my own left-wing party is sitting in the exact same cabinet as them, signing the exact same budgets, who do I blame?
You lose the fundamental mechanism of political accountability. The SVM coalition essentially erased the concept of an opposition. The ideological boundaries evaporated into a bureaucratic gray zone.
The Social Democrats and Venstre effectively told their base that core values were secondary to the sheer mechanics of holding power.
And the electorate is punishing them for it today. The frustration of watching the center collapse into a generic mush has birthed a wildly fragmented field of players. Venstre, the traditional powerhouse of the right, is absolutely bleeding voters. Their base is scattering in every possible direction.
You see a significant migration toward the conservatives, and a large portion of the rural working-class right migrating to the Denmark Democrats, which is a populist party highly skeptical of central Copenhagen politics.
But looking at the data from the past 3 weeks of campaigning, the most fascinating anomaly on the right is the Liberal Alliance.
Oh, wow, yes. The sources highlight their leader, Alex Van Upslav. He's only 33 years old, and he has built this absolute juggernaut of a youth movement.
It is a libertarian, low-tax, anti-regulation, highly individualistic party that has somehow completely captured the Gen Z vote in Denmark. He communicates almost entirely through highly produced, incredibly viral TikTok campaigns.
Which is fascinating sociologically, right? Because Scandinavia is traditionally known for a collective mindset, the idea that the community supersedes the individual.
Absolutely. The sudden surge of a fiercely individualistic, libertarian movement among the youth suggests a deep structural anxiety. Younger voters are looking at the housing market, inflation, and the massive tax burden required to support an aging demographic, and they're basically rejecting the collective economic model their parents built.
And the craziest part of the Liberal Alliance's surge is what happened during this tiny 3-week campaign window. Right in the middle of the sprint, Alex Van Opsla admitted to a massive cocaine scandal.
He publicly confessed to using cocaine while actively serving as the leader of the party.
In almost any traditional Western political framework, a scandal of that specific nature, detonating mid-campaign, would force an immediate resignation. The party's polling would instantly crater as the media focused entirely on the lack of judgment and criminal behavior.
But look at the polling data in the stack. His numbers didn't move a millimeter.
Not an inch.
The Liberal Alliance was frozen at a solid 11% before the confession, and they stayed at 11% after. His young voter base completely ignored it.
It demonstrates a fundamental shift in what the electorate values. The traditional metrics of political morality, the expectation of statesmanlike behavior, they hold zero weight for a generation that feels economically disenfranchised.
They prioritize economic disruption and perceived authenticity over traditional behavioral norms. If he is promising to slash their taxes and deregulate their economic future, they view a personal drug scandal as entirely irrelevant to their material interests.
Which perfectly illustrates how chaotic the traditional blue bloc has become. But the red bloc isn't doing much better. The Social Democrats dragged themselves so far to the center to form this government that their left flank is totally exposed.
The Socialist People's Party is surging by simply offering classic, old-school welfare and green policies. And the far-left Red-Green Alliance is just furious about the compromises.
This fragmentation across both the left and the right has created a massive vacuum in the absolute center of Danish politics. And that vacuum is currently occupied by the most ruthless tactician in the country.
Lars Løkke Rasmussen, the leader of the moderates.
If we are using the reality show analogy, this guy is the ultimate survivor.
His political trajectory is staggering. He is a former prime minister who previously led the right-wing Venstre party. He was ousted from power, endured a brutal internal civil war within his own party, and was essentially cast into political exile.
Most politicians in their late 50s just accept a cushy board seat at a bank at that point. But instead, he starts a brand new party from scratch, the moderates. He runs on a platform of pure, unadulterated pragmatism. He essentially says, the blocks are dead. I will work with whoever gives me the most influence.
He was the actual architect behind the SVM government in 2022.
And looking at the dead heat polls today, his small moderate party is sitting right on the fulcrum. Neither the fractured left nor the fractured right currently has the 90 seats required to command a majority. Lars Løkke Rasmussen holds the keys. He is the kingmaker.
But if you look at the macro picture, if the Social Democrats and Venstre, the two main pillars of this grand centrist experiment, are both facing potentially their worst election results in a century today, doesn't that inherently mean the pragmatic experiment failed?
The voters clearly hated the mushy middle.
It is the paradox. The voters are heavily punishing the architects of the center, yes. But the fact that Rasmussen's moderates still hold the mathematical balance of power implies that the electorate hasn't neatly sorted back into the old red and blue columns either.
They despise the Grand Coalition, but they are still heavily relying on a centrist broker to prevent the extremes from taking over.
To really grasp why the Danish political spectrum is fracturing over these economic and social issues, we have to pull the lens back. We have to look at the broader Scandinavian context.
Right, because if you ask someone in Madrid or Rome or certainly Washington, D.C. what they think of the Nordic model, they imagine a homogeneous, perfectly balanced machine. But the sources spend a lot of time deconstructing how the outside world profoundly misunderstands the mechanics of this region.
The international perception of Scandinavia reveals far more about the domestic anxieties of the observer than it does about the reality of the region itself.
Let's examine the American viewpoint, because the stack shows it is the most distorted. The sources note that in the United States, the Nordic region is effectively used as an ideological cudgel by both ends of the political spectrum.
For the American progressive movement, Scandinavia is elevated as the ultimate proof of concept for democratic socialism. It is cited as evidence that a state can heavily tax its citizens, provide universal health care, mandate free university education, and still maintain a high standard of living. It's viewed as a compassionate, state-driven utopia.
Conversely, for the American conservative movement, Scandinavia is depicted as a stifling, over-regulated nanny state that crushes entrepreneurial spirit, where citizens surrender their autonomy to an overbearing bureaucracy.
And according to the economic analysis in our stack, both of those American projections are fundamentally incorrect.
They are incorrect because they are applying a rigid American binary of socialism versus capitalism to a system that operates completely outside that binary. Denmark is not a socialist country in any functional economic sense. The government does not own the means of production.
In reality, the Danish economy is an intensely, almost ruthlessly efficient capitalist machine.
This was the biggest paradigm shift for me in the sources. I had always operated under the assumption that a generous European welfare state naturally required incredibly rigid labor laws. You imagine a system where it is virtually impossible to fire an employee, with layers of government red tape protecting every single job.
But the sources focus heavily on the Danish labor mechanism known as flexicurity.
Flexicurity.
Yes, flexicurity is the cornerstone of their economic resilience. It is a portmanteau of flexibility and security, and its mechanics are entirely market-driven. In Denmark, it is functionally easier and faster for a corporation to terminate an employee than it is in most parts of the United States.
Wait, I need to pause on that. Easier to fire someone in a Scandinavian social democracy than in America. How does a left-wing government allow that?
Because they understand the macroeconomics of global competition. The Danish labor market is highly deregulated regarding hiring and firing. If a company faces a sudden downturn in the global market, they can shed their workforce almost instantly. They are not bogged down by massive severance mandates or government litigation.
That is the flexibility part. It allows Danish businesses to pivot and adapt with incredible speed.
But if corporations can just axe thousands of jobs overnight without government penalty, why aren't the workers rioting in the streets?
Right.
Because of the security side of the equation. When a Danish worker loses their job, the state immediately intervenes with a safety net that is unfathomable to an American worker. The unemployment benefits can replace up to 90% of their previous income for an extended period.
90%.
The state heavily subsidizes aggressive retraining programs to pivot that worker into a new industry. And crucially, because healthcare is universal, losing your job does not mean losing access to your doctor or bankrupting your family over a medical emergency.
So the psychological terror of unemployment is basically removed. The worker isn't clinging to a doomed job out of fear for their survival, and the corporation isn't paralyzed by the fear of hiring someone they can never let go.
Exactly. It creates a hyper-dynamic, frictionless economy. And to further shatter the American progressive myth, there is no legally mandated minimum wage in Denmark. The government does not dictate what a worker must be paid.
So what physically stops a Danish fast food franchise or a retail chain from paying someone $3 an hour? I mean, if there is no law against it, capitalism dictates they should drop wages to the floor.
The mechanism that prevents that is incredibly robust collective bargaining. Over 60% of the Danish workforce is unionized, and the unions negotiate directly with powerful employer associations. They set the wages sector by sector.
The state deliberately stays completely out of the room.
It is a pure private market negotiation between organized labor and organized capital. If the government intervened with a minimum wage law, it would actually undermine the power of the unions to negotiate better terms.
And you can see the results of this hyper-capitalist structure when you look at the sheer scale of the businesses they produce. We have to give a massive shout out to Danish industry here because they punch so wildly above their weight class, it literally alters global economics. Let's look at Novo Nordisk.
The pharmaceutical titan.
Right, the manufacturer of Ozempic and Wegovy. The sources point out that the global explosion in demand for these weight loss drugs has made Novo Nordisk so unfathomably wealthy that this single company is shifting the macroeconomic indicators of the entire nation of Denmark.
When Novo Nordisk repatriates its US dollars into Danish kroner, it actually affects the national currency pegged to the euro. A 6 million person country is hosting Europe's most valuable company.
It is a staggering concentration of corporate power, and their dominance extends far beyond pharmaceuticals. Consider Maersk.
The global shipping giant. They are currently the second largest container shipping line on Earth, only recently edged out by MSC out of Switzerland. They essentially control the arteries of global trade.
And perhaps the most aggressive example of Danish corporate expansionism is DSV.
Yes, the DSV story in the sources is fascinating.
It really is. They started in the 1970s as a tiny, scrappy collective of independent truck drivers hauling dirt and gravel. But through a relentless, purely mathematical strategy of mergers and acquisitions, they just kept swallowing their competitors whole.
Last year, they executed a massive takeover, buying Schenker from the German state railway system, Deutsche Bahn.
By acquiring Schenker, this former underdog Danish trucking company instantly became one of the absolute largest global logistics and freight forwarding empires on the planet.
So when Europeans look at Denmark, they don't see Bernie Sanders' utopia. They see a ruthless, efficient corporate powerhouse.
But how does that contrast with how Europeans view the rest of Scandinavia? If I'm sitting in Budapest or Madrid, how do I differentiate Denmark from Sweden or Norway? Because we often just lump them all together.
The European perspective is much more attuned to the friction between the neighbors. They see three distinct operating models. Norway is viewed as the incredibly wealthy, isolated outlier. They are not a member of the European Union.
Their society is insulated by a sovereign wealth fund currently valued at over $1.7 trillion, built entirely on North Sea oil and gas revenues.
They are essentially an oil-funded social democracy. They don't have to make the same brutal economic choices because they have a massive financial cushion to fall back on.
Must be nice. What about Sweden?
Sweden, on the other hand, is viewed by Europe as the moralistic reformer. Historically, the Swedish political establishment has viewed itself as a humanitarian superpower. Their policy decisions are frequently framed not just as practical solutions, but as moral imperatives. They operate with a deeply ingrained idealism.
And Denmark?
Denmark is the hyper-pragmatic mechanic. They are highly skeptical of Swedish idealism. They do not care about presenting themselves as morally superior on the global stage. They care exclusively about maintaining the structural integrity of their welfare state.
Which brings us directly to the single most explosive issue driving the election today. There is one specific policy arena where this ruthless pragmatism is most visible, and it is the exact issue that shattered the traditional political blocs and completely redefined the Danish political identity.
Immigration.
Yes. If you want to understand the survival of Mette Frederiksen's Social Democrats and why the far-right populist wave that swept through Europe basically bypassed Denmark, you have to look at their pivot on border control.
According to the sources, Denmark enforces some of the absolute strictest immigration, asylum, and integration laws in all of Europe. They discuss controversial policies like seizing assets from asylum seekers to pay for their stay or pushing to process asylum claims in third countries outside of Europe.
But the detail that completely short-circuits an international observer is that these draconian border policies aren't being pushed by an insurgent far-right nationalist party. They are championed by the center-left Social Democrats.
They are the cornerstone of Mette Frederiksen's political thesis, and her argument relies entirely on cold mathematical logic rather than ideological compassion.
She argues that the existence of a high-benefit, universal welfare state is fundamentally incompatible with open borders.
Her logic is, if you offer 90% unemployment benefits, free universities, and universal health care, and you allow unlimited access to people entering the country who haven't historically paid into that tax system, the math simply collapses. The Treasury goes bankrupt.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just the fiscal math. She recognized that the massive taxation required to fund the welfare state relies entirely on social trust. If the working class base of the Social Democratic Party feels that their tax money is being siphoned away to manage the complex integration of non-Western immigrants, that trust erodes and they will refuse to support the high tax regime.
So, sensing that the far-right populist parties were gaining massive ground among the working class by talking about immigration, the left-wing prime minister she stole their playbook. She adopted their strictest border policies as her own.
That is the precise tactical maneuver, and its effectiveness was devastating. By co-opting the immigration issue, the Social Democrats completely neutered the far right.
The Danish People's Party, which had been a massive nationalist force in Danish politics, saw their polling numbers completely collapse. I mean, why would a voter support a fringe far-right party when the mainstream center-left party is already implementing the exact border closures they want while also protecting their union wages?
But surely that triggered a massive revolt on her left flank. If you are a progressive voter who believes in international humanitarian obligations, watching your left-wing leader adopt right-wing border policies must feel like a profound betrayal of your core values.
It did trigger immense internal criticism. The left-wing critics in our stack argue that she essentially sold the soul of the party to maintain power, adopting policies of cruelty and isolationism. They argue that protecting the welfare state at the expense of human rights violates the fundamental tenets of social democracy.
But the pragmatic defenders of the policy argue that it was the only way to save the social contract from completely unraveling, and they point directly across the Öresund Bridge to Sweden as the ultimate cautionary tale.
The contrast with Sweden provided in the sources is staggering. It highlights the exact difference between Swedish idealism and Danish pragmatism.
In 2015, during the height of the European migration crisis, Sweden took a highly idealistic moral stance. They declared their borders open to refugees. In that single year, a country of about 10 million people took in over 160,000 asylum seekers.
Proportionally, it was a massive influx. The Swedish political establishment viewed it as their humanitarian duty.
But the sources detail how the mechanics of integrating that many people completely broke down.
The Swedish labor market, heavily unionized and demanding high skills, struggled to absorb the influx of largely unskilled labor. This led to massive geographic segregation. Immigrants were concentrated in specific suburbs outside major cities, creating parallel societies with deeply entrenched unemployment and marginalization.
Which eventually erupted into the current ongoing crisis of gang violence. The sources point out that Sweden now has one of the highest rates of fatal shootings per capita in Europe, driven entirely by organized criminal networks operating out of these marginalized suburbs. The idealism essentially backfired into a severe security crisis.
And the political consequence was the meteoric rise of the far-right Sweden Democrats. Because the mainstream Swedish parties refused to discuss the negative impacts of immigration for years, labeling such discussions as racist, they handed the monopoly on the issue to the far right.
The Sweden Democrats surged from a fringe neo-Nazi-linked group to becoming the second largest party in the Swedish parliament, literally dictating terms to the current government.
So Sweden absorbed the full force of the populist shockwave because they clung to their moral idealism, while Denmark preempted the shockwave by abandoning their idealism and adopting ruthless border math.
Precisely. And in a remarkable validation of the Danish strategy, the current Swedish government has recently been forced to execute a massive pivot, essentially adopting the Danish model of highly restrictive borders and aggressive policing tactics to regain control of the state.
But whether we are talking about the Danish flexicurity model, the massive taxation, or the strict immigration policies designed to protect the system, all of this relies on one invisible foundational element.
The entire Scandinavian model collapses without it. The sources refer to it as the currency of social trust.
Social trust is the bedrock upon which every Nordic institution is built. You are only willing to hand over 50% of your income to the state if you fundamentally trust that the state is competent, that the bureaucracy is uncorrupted, and crucially, that your neighbor is also paying their fair share and not abusing the system.
But the sources suggest that this glossy picture of a high-trust society is cracking. And it's not just a Danish phenomenon. The erosion of trust is happening across the region. But before we look at how it's breaking, we need to understand the mechanics of where this trust actually came from. It isn't some magical aura that hovers over Northern Europe.
No, it is the result of centuries of highly specific historical and demographic conditioning. The Nordic trust was built through extreme ethnic, cultural, and religious homogeneity. For hundreds of years, these were isolated agrarian societies unified by a strict Lutheran Protestant work ethic that emphasized duty, transparency, and communal obligation.
Add to that a history of relatively low economic inequality. If everyone in your town looks like you, practices the same religion, holds the same moral framework regarding work, and earns roughly the same amount of money, the friction of daily life is incredibly low. Trust is easy when society is a mirror.
But that foundation is now buckling under the pressures of the 21st century. Globalization and non-Western immigration have dismantled the baseline homogeneity. You are now attempting to maintain a system built for a homogeneous population in an increasingly heterogeneous society with competing cultural norms.
And then you introduce the digital accelerant, social media.
Right. The social media algorithms that dominate public discourse are actively importing American-style polarization and culture wars into Scandinavia. The algorithms are designed to reward outrage, tribalism, and ideological purity. This fundamentally destroys the consensus-driven, compromise-heavy dialogue that was required to build the trust in the first place.
But it isn't just about citizens losing trust in each other. If I am a taxpayer looking at my massive tax bill, the more urgent question is, do I still trust the political elites to manage my money? Do I trust that they are operating with the same moral compass they preach to me?
And according to the events unfolding in the early months of 2026, the public's answer to that question is increasingly cynical.
The sources outline a scandal in neighboring Norway that serves as the ultimate devastating case study of elite disconnect. The institutional rot exposed here is profound. And relying strictly on the verified facts from the source texts, without fixating on the specific names, but rather the roles these individuals played, we can see exactly how the facade of the perfect Nordic society shatters.
In January 2026, the United States Department of Justice unsealed a trove of files detailing the complex international financial network of the late Jeffrey Epstein. And the contents of those files sent an absolute earthquake through the highest echelons of the Norwegian political and diplomatic establishment.
The documents reveal that the very top tier of Norway's foreign policy elite, the people trusted to represent the peace nation on the global stage, had deep, ongoing financial and personal entanglements with Epstein.
We're talking about individuals at the absolute pinnacle of power. A former Norwegian prime minister, several top-level diplomats, and the leader of a highly influential global economic forum were all directly implicated.
The institutional fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The former prime minister and the top diplomats were formally indicted for gross corruption. The leader of the Global Economic Forum was forced to resign in disgrace.
But it is the specific mechanics of how the money flowed that really illuminates the hypocrisy. How does a billionaire sex offender interface with the Norwegian diplomatic corps?
The DOJ files detailed how Epstein systematically funneled massive amounts of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, into an international peace think tank. And the director of this specific think tank was one of these top-level Norwegian diplomats.
And here is the horrific irony. The sources confirmed that the Norwegian government, meaning the Norwegian taxpayer, had been funding that exact same peace organization for years through its foreign aid budget.
So you have a scenario where the Norwegian state is pouring millions of dollars of public money into a think tank that is simultaneously operating in coordination with and being funded by the world's most notorious convicted sex offender.
And the entanglement was deeply personal. The files revealed that mere days before Epstein's death, he altered his will to include a clause funneling millions of dollars directly to the children of this top Norwegian diplomat. It was not merely a professional overlap, it was a deeply integrated relationship.
And the most infuriating detail for the public is that the Norwegian authorities allegedly knew about this years in advance.
Really?
Yes, the sources state that back in 2019, Norwegian authorities actually alerting U.S. investigators to allegations that this specific peace think tank was recruiting young, unqualified women from Eastern Europe under the guise of short-term internships, and that their photographs were being shared with Epstein.
It completely incinerates the national self-image. Norway has spent decades cultivating a brand as a global humanitarian superpower, the honest broker who facilitates peace accords and funds global development.
And suddenly, the public is confronted with evidence that their foreign policy elite were allegedly utilizing these international humanitarian institutions as a revolving door to accumulate personal wealth and network with criminal billionaires.
Which feeds directly into the current, highly toxic debate regarding how Norway spends its money. Norway is incredibly generous on paper. They allocate over 1% of their gross national income to foreign aid. Per capita, no one gives more.
But the Epstein scandal completely severed the public's blind faith in how that money is actually being deployed.
Taxpayers are demanding transparency. They're questioning whether the foreign aid budget is actually alleviating global poverty, or if it is simply a massive slush fund used to finance elite networking clubs in Geneva and New York. And the scrutiny has revealed some deeply cynical accounting practices.
Yes, the sources highlight a staggering statistic from the 2024 budget. Fully 7% of Norway's entire international foreign aid budget was actually spent inside the borders of Norway.
Wait, inside Norway?
Inside Norway. The government utilized a bureaucratic loophole to classify the domestic costs of housing, processing, and integrating refugees as foreign aid.
They're essentially transferring money from the foreign aid budget to domestic municipal budgets, paying themselves, and logging it internationally as an act of global solidarity.
If you are an average Danish voter walking into a polling booth today, watching this level of corruption and cynical accounting unfold in neighboring Norway, how does that impact your behavior? It has to absolutely supercharge the anti-establishment sentiment we're seeing with the rise of the moderates and the Liberal Alliance.
It acts as a massive accelerant for political fragmentation. It destroys the illusion of Nordic moral exceptionalism. The voter realizes that their elite class is just as susceptible to corruption, wealth hoarding, and institutional capture as the elites in Washington, London, or Brussels.
The naive, inherent trust in the system is dead. And when a voter no longer trusts the moral compass of the establishment, they stop voting based on collective idealism and start voting purely on pragmatic, cynical self-interest.
And speaking of cynical self-interest and immense geopolitical pressure, we have to transition to the absolute massive elephant in the room regarding this election. It is an issue that overshadows all domestic policy debates.
It involves the melting of the Arctic ice, the world's largest island, and the aggressive demands of the President of the United States.
The geopolitics of Greenland. It is the defining external crisis of this election cycle.
For anyone outside of Denmark, the dynamic here is fascinating and slightly bizarre. Greenland is an absolutely massive territory. Geographically, it is larger than Mexico, but it is populated by only about 57,000 people, predominantly indigenous Inuit. And politically, it operates as a self-governing territory within the broader Kingdom of Denmark.
Its strategic value in the 21st century is nearly incalculable. As climate change accelerates the melting of the Arctic ice sheet, Greenland has suddenly become the center of a global geopolitical scramble.
Because beneath the ice lie massive, untapped deposits of rare earth minerals that are absolutely critical for the global transition to green energy and the manufacturing of advanced microchips.
Furthermore, the retreating ice is opening up new, highly lucrative shipping routes across the top of the world, routes that could cut weeks off the journey between European and Asian markets.
And from a purely military standpoint, the territory is indispensable. The United States operates the Thule Air Base, recently renamed Pituffik Space Base on the northwestern coast of Greenland.
It provides the U.S. military with a crucial northern vantage point for missile defense early warning systems and satellite tracking, specifically aimed at countering Russian and Chinese activity in the Arctic theater.
Which brings us to Donald Trump. He initially proposed buying Greenland from Denmark back in 2019. At the time, Mette Frederiksen shut the idea down immediately, calling it absurd and stating clearly that Greenland was not for sale.
But the sources detail how this situation escalated from a bizarre real estate inquiry into a severe geopolitical crisis in 2025 and 2026.
The rhetoric shifted from a transactional proposal to an aggressive national security demand. The U.S. administration began utilizing threats of heavy economic and military coercion, demanding that Denmark cede sovereignty of Greenland to the United States.
The justification was explicitly framed around U.S. national security, arguing that Denmark was incapable of securing the territory against encroaching Russian submarines and Chinese mining investments.
This places the Danish government in an incredibly precarious position. They are a small European nation relying entirely on the U.S.-led NATO alliance for their own security, while simultaneously being threatened by the leader of that alliance.
But to truly understand the friction here, we have to look at the relationship between Denmark and Greenland. It is not a partnership of equals. It is a relationship deeply scarred by a dark colonial history.
Greenland operated as a formal Danish colony until 1953, and the sociological damage inflicted during that period still dominates the relationship today. The sources highlight one particularly devastating historical event from 1951 to illustrate the paternalistic nature of Danish rule.
The social experiment involving the children.
Yes. In 1951, Danish authorities orchestrated an experiment where 22 Greenlandic Inuit children were physically separated from their families and relocated to mainland Denmark.
The stated goal was forced assimilation. The Danish government intended to educate these children, strip them of their native language and culture, and eventually return them to Greenland as a new Danish-friendly elite class who would help modernize the island.
The hubris of that is astounding, and the human cost was catastrophic.
It was an utter failure. The children were deeply traumatized. Many lost the ability to communicate with their own families upon returning. They faced severe social isolation, and many struggled with substance abuse and early death. The Danish government did not issue an official apology for this atrocity until the year 2020.
So when an American president suddenly threatens to annex the island as a strategic asset, he is stepping into a geopolitical dynamic that is already fraught with deep historical trauma and suspicion.
Politically, Greenland's ultimate goal is full independence from Denmark. They want sovereignty over their own land. But the brutal economic reality is that they are deeply tethered to Copenhagen. The Danish government currently provides Greenland with an annual block grant of roughly $1 billion.
That block grant constitutes a massive percentage of Greenland's total government budget. Because their domestic economy is currently heavily reliant on the fishing industry, they simply do not possess the diversified economic infrastructure required to sustain an independent modern state without that Danish capital.
So you have a territory that wants independence but needs Danish money, and a Danish state that relies on Greenland for its geopolitical relevance but struggles with its colonial guilt. And ironically, the aggressive threats from the U.S. actually forced these two uneasy partners closer together.
The external pressure acted as a unifying force. In response to the U.S. coercion, Copenhagen and Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, expedited a new 1.6 billion kroner agreement focused on infrastructure and healthcare development. They temporarily shelved their internal disputes to present a unified front against American annexation.
But I'm curious about the psychology of the average Danish voter regarding this crisis. If I walk up to someone on the street in Copenhagen today, are they fiercely protective of Greenland? Is there a deep, emotional, national kinship with the island?
The sources describe the Danish public's relationship with Greenland as a profound exercise in cognitive dissonance. The vast majority of Danes have never visited Greenland. It is geographically isolated and culturally distinct. The relationship is characterized by an abstract, somewhat paternalistic pride, coupled with a near-total absence of daily, tangible connection.
There is an anecdote in the sources that perfectly encapsulates this superficial solidarity. During the peak of the tensions with the U.S. over the annexation threats, a local shop owner in Copenhagen began producing and selling baseball caps with the slogan "Nudet NUK," playing on the name of the Greenlandic capital.
It was designed as a direct satirical parody of the red Magi hats in the United States.
And the hats sold out instantly. Everyone in Copenhagen wanted one. And yes, The proceeds from the sales were directed to charities supporting Greenlandic children.
It was a nice gesture, but it ultimately highlights that the public solidarity was primarily a reactive, symbolic stance against an external bully, rather than a reflection of a deep, nuanced understanding of Greenland's domestic struggles.
Precisely. For the Danish political establishment, Greenland is an immense, invaluable strategic asset that grants a small European nation outsized leverage in the halls of Washington.
For the Greenlandic government, Denmark is an imperfect, historically problematic, but currently necessary financial sponsor on their long, slow road to independence. And today, the Danish voters casting their ballots are heavily weighing which political leader possesses the necessary ruthlessness to navigate a hostile American administration demanding control of their territory.
So we synthesize all of this. The threat of U.S. annexation in the Arctic, the profound erosion of domestic social trust, fueled by elite corruption scandals in neighboring states, the absolute fragmentation of the traditional left-right political blocs.
It all culminates today, March 24, 2026. What exactly is going to happen when the polls close at 8:20 p.m. tonight?
The final pre-election polling data indicates an absolute dead heat. The electorate is fractured beyond immediate repair.
Looking at the data in our stack, the math is incredibly tight. The Folketinget has 179 seats. You need 90 seats to command majority and avoid a vote of no confidence. Currently, the red bloc, the fractured left-wing coalition, is hovering right around 88 seats.
The blue bloc, the chaotic right-wing coalition, is sitting at roughly 80 seats.
And positioned perfectly in the center, Lars Løkke Rasmussen's moderates are projected to secure approximately 12 seats. That 12-seat margin makes them the absolute, undisputed kingmakers of this election. Whichever bloc they decide to support will hold the keys to the Prime Minister's office.
But the statistic that should terrify every single politician waiting for the results tonight is the undecided vote. A massive 20% of the electorate is undecided.
1 in 5 Danish voters woke up this morning, looked at this fractured landscape, and had absolutely no idea who they were going to vote for.
Which means the final distribution of seats could swing wildly in the final hours. Based on the structural dynamics, the political analysts in our sources are projecting 3 potential scenarios for how this resolves.
Let's break down the logic of each scenario. Scenario 1 seems to rely on the incumbent surviving the storm.
In Scenario 1, Mette Frederiksen retains the Prime Minister's office. However, her Social Democratic Party suffers significant losses. She is heavily weakened, and in order to reach the 90-seat threshold, she is forced into a grueling negotiation to form a highly complex, fragile coalition, almost certainly requiring heavy concessions to Rasmussen's moderates once again.
Basically, the SVM experiment limps forward on like support. Okay, Scenario 2.
Scenario 2 envisions a complete reconfiguration of the center. The traditional red and blue blocs dissolve even further, and a brand new constellation of centrist parties, pulling from both the center-left and center-right, agree to a broad governing pact specifically designed to isolate and lock out the increasingly powerful extreme flanks of the left and right.
And Scenario 3?
The blue surprise. The heavily fragmented right-wing parties, Venstre, the Conservatives, the Liberal Alliance Youth Movement, and the Rural Populists somehow managed to suppress their deep internal divisions, unite their seat count, secure the backing of the moderates, and successfully install a conservative prime minister executing a complete change of government.
But here is the most important mechanical difference that international observers need to grasp. The election does not actually end tonight when the polls close. If you are watching an American or British election, the winner is generally declared by midnight, a concession speech is given, and the transition of power begins the next morning.
Tonight in Denmark merely decides the mathematical raw materials.
Tonight simply provides the seat count. Tomorrow morning is when the actual grueling game of Danish politics begins.
Because tomorrow the process moves to Amalienborg Palace. The king will officially appoint a royal investigator, typically the leader of the party that secured the most seats.
And that investigator is tasked with a monumental challenge. They will spend days, or more likely weeks, locked in closed-door negotiations. They will be horse-trading cabinet positions, arguing over specific budget line items, and desperately trying to build a coalition alliance that won't be immediately destroyed by a negative majority the second parliament opens.
It is a masterclass in pragmatic backroom negotiation. The ideology is checked at the door. The math dictates the outcome.
Okay, let's pull back and look at the vast ground we have covered in this deep dive. We started by dismantling the rigid timelines of American politics to understand the tactical, opportunistic genius or chaos of snap elections and the survival mechanics of negative parliamentarism.
We analyzed the historic shattering of the traditional red-blue divide with the formation of the SVM Grand Coalition and how that destruction of political accountability fueled the rise of the TikTok-savvy libertarian youth and the ultimate centrist kingmaker.
We looked at the intense, hyper-capitalist reality of the Danish economy, the flexicurity model, the union dominance over wages, and the massive global footprints of Novo Nordisk, Maersk, and DSV. We examined the cold mathematics of the Nordic immigration consensus, watching the left completely adopt the right's border playbook to protect the welfare state, avoiding the catastrophic integration failures that robbed Sweden.
We exposed the cracking foundation of social trust, utilizing the devastating Epstein corruption scandal in Norway to understand why voters are increasingly cynical about the moral superiority of their elites and the opaque management of foreign aid.
And finally, we zoomed out to the massive geopolitical chess match playing out over Greenland, where historical colonial trauma collides with the aggressive, real-time demands of an American president desperate to secure the Arctic.
It is a profound structural deviation from the outdated narrative of the stable, predictable, flawless Scandinavian utopia.
Which leaves you with a final, provocative thought to mull over as you watch the actual numbers roll in from Copenhagen tonight. For decades, the entire Western world has looked at Scandinavia as a finished product, a flawless, high-tax, high-trust blueprint ready to be imported and copied.
But looking at the incredibly fractured, highly tactical reality of the Danish election today, what if the Danish model isn't a finished product at all?
What if what we are watching tonight is simply the first real-time experiment in whether a modern Western democracy can survive the immense pressures of the 21st century by entirely abandoning political ideology in favor of ruthless mathematical pragmatism?
It is an experiment that every major democracy will eventually be forced to run.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us on the Topic Lens podcast. And remember, sometimes the clearest X-ray doesn't show you the broken bone. Sometimes it just shows you how murky the waters really are.